Canada's Indigenous communities are standing firm against what they see as a resource grab disguised as economic necessity, and the latest trade tensions might have just awakened a sleeping giant. While politicians in Ottawa and Washington talk about critical minerals and economic sovereignty, the people who actually live on these lands are saying not so fast. We're talking about the Ring of Fire, a crescent-shaped stretch of northern Ontario that holds billions of dollars worth of minerals desperately needed for America's tech industry. But there's a problem. The Indigenous communities who call this land home aren't buying into the rush to dig it all up. So what exactly is happening in Canada's north? And why are Indigenous leaders like Saul Mamakwa warning that governments are using trade pressures as an excuse to override their rights? To understand this story, we need to go back to what the Ring of Fire actually is. Located about 1,000 kilometers north of Toronto in Ontario's James Bay lowlands, this remote area is believed to contain massive deposits of chromite, nickel, copper, and platinum group metals, the exact minerals needed for electric vehicle batteries, cell phones, and computers. Mining companies have been eyeing this region for years, but large-scale extraction hasn't begun because of the massive infrastructure costs required. We're talking about building new roads, logistics hubs, and supply chains in one of Canada's most remote regions. Then came the latest round of trade tensions, and suddenly everything changed. The announcement of 25% tariffs on Canadian goods with a notably lower 10% rate on energy materials, including critical minerals, sent a clear message about what America really wants from its northern neighbor.
All of this underscores is the importance of the upcoming review of CUSMA. A review, we're doing our consultations for that as the Americans, as are the Mexicans, and there will be discussions that begin in a few months' time. And our objective is going to be obviously the best deal for Canada, but also to get ourselves in a position where there aren't these specific issues, important issues that are erupting, on an episodic basis, if I can put it that way.
As one expert put it, if these minerals weren't absolutely essential, they would have been hit with the full 25% tariff rate too. The lower rate on critical minerals reveals just how desperate the situation has become.
100% tariff on any patented drugs coming into the US effective October 1st. He's left room for exemptions if the company producing the drug is building a plant in the US. For more, I'm joined by Bloomberg's Brendan Murray, who tracks global trade. Brendan, what more details will we be looking for out of these tariffs? The president also announcing duties, of course, on heavy trucks and kitchen cabinets. What is the thinking behind all of this?
Yeah, exactly. I think we have a lot more questions than answers at this stage based off of the president's social media post late yesterday. For the pharmaceuticals, he described the tariffs as applying to companies' exports that they don't have anything under construction at the moment. What exactly does that mean? There are about $1 trillion worth of investments pledged by pharmaceutical companies in the U.S., but depending on what stage those are in the development, whether they're actually under construction or they're just investment pledges, at this stage, it's hard to define that. As far as the other issues, heavy trucks are also under these so-called 232 investigations. So, this would be part of these sectoral tariffs that the president is rolling out. We now have something like 12 to 15 of these investigations going on. And what these do is provide a plan B in case the administration's across-the-board, country-by-country tariffs.
Prime Minister Mark Carney has made exploiting the Ring of Fire one of his government's strategic priorities, calling it essential for building Canada into an energy superpower less reliant on American trade. Ontario Premier Doug Ford has been even more aggressive, saying he's ready to jump on a bulldozer himself to build the necessary roads. Both leaders are framing this as protecting Canadian sovereignty against external threats.
A lot of jobs and a lot of employment in peril.
And are we turning our focus now? With all the tariffs and everything that's gone on, is the government now turning its focus to realistically saying, you know what, let's work on CUSMA and resolve all of this at the same time, or hopefully resolve all of this at the same time?
Yeah, the challenge, of course, is that what we want may not be how things unfold. So you see the government trying to do a couple of things simultaneously. In part, he's there because he does need to diversify Canada's trading options and make certain that we build greater links with the UK, with Europe. Similarly, in other venues, we'd be reaching out. Earlier in the week, he was signing a free trade agreement with Indonesia. So that's one track, if you will. The other track is recognizing the reality of how huge and how vital the U.S. market is for Canadians and for Canadian industry, shifting the focus away from these one-off fights that we've been having on particular sectors and trying to preserve the very concept and the structured deal and the protection that affords us of North American free trade, of the CUSMA agreement. The challenge, of course, is we cannot be sure that Donald Trump cares to preserve North American free trade. There might be, one could argue, every indication that he does not. And that, I think, is also why you see Mark Carney talking so fervently about this, trying to prioritize it.
But here's where the story gets complicated. The Indigenous communities who actually live in and around the Ring of Fire region aren't impressed by this sudden urgency. Saul Mamakwa, who represents the area in Ontario's provincial parliament, grew up hearing his grandparents and parents predict this exact scenario. They always said there would come a day when governments and settlers would want access to their lands because of the minerals buried beneath them. Mamakwa's constituency covers an area roughly the size of Italy and includes the mineral-rich Ring of Fire region along with the First Nations communities around it. He's been vocal about what he sees as governments using trade tensions as a convenient excuse to fast-track resource extraction without proper consultation. As he told reporters, you cannot use a tariff war to override the rights of First Nations people who live on these lands. The tension here runs much deeper than just mining permits and environmental assessments. Indigenous communities are worried that Canadian authorities will move forward with Ring of Fire development without their free, prior, and informed consent, a principle that's supposed to be protected under Canadian law and international agreements like the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Experts from Ontario's Western University have warned against underestimating the challenges ahead, specifically pointing to opposition from Indigenous communities as a major obstacle to Ring of Fire development. This isn't just bureaucratic red tape we're talking about. It's about fundamental questions of land rights, treaty obligations, and who gets to make decisions about resource extraction on traditional territories. The demographic reality on the ground makes this even more complex. The Ring of Fire region includes areas where Indigenous communities have lived for generations, and many of these communities have never ceded their rights to the land through treaties. What makes this particularly frustrating for Indigenous leaders is the speed with which governments are now promising to move. After decades of slow progress on mining development in the region, suddenly there's talk of fast-tracking approvals, creating special economic zones, and cutting through regulatory processes. The timing, coinciding perfectly with trade pressures, feels suspicious to many Indigenous observers. Mamakwa has been particularly critical of what he sees as the province's strategy of dividing First Nations communities to get projects approved. He's warned that Ontario is continuing its long tradition of trying to conquer Indigenous territories by splitting communities and getting some to agree while others object. His message is clear: our lands are not for sale. The legal landscape around these issues has been shifting rapidly. Recent court decisions have raised the bar for consultation obligations under the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. One precedent-setting federal court win could change the entire regulatory landscape, making it much riskier for developers to proceed without deep, meaningful consultation with affected Indigenous communities. This puts the Canadian government in a difficult position. On one hand, there's enormous pressure to respond to trade tensions and economic threats by developing domestic resources quickly. The Ring of Fire represents a potential game changer for Canada's economic independence, with estimates suggesting the region could supply critical minerals for decades to come. On the other hand, rushing ahead without proper Indigenous consultation could lead to years of legal challenges, protests, and project delays. The broader context here is an apparent strategy of using economic pressure to gain access to Canadian resources. Some experts believe the tariff war is partly designed to soften up Canada for what one analyst called a reciprocal mineral deal. American advisors almost certainly know about the Ring of Fire deposits and understand their strategic importance for American industry. The irony is that Canada really does have what's needed: As one mining expert noted, Canada is the storehouse of every critical mineral that American industry needs, every single one of them. The country is home to 40% of the world's listed mining companies and ranks in the top 5 globally for 10 of the world's most important critical minerals. Yet the current approach seems determined to treat Canada as an adversary rather than the solution to America's mineral supply challenges. For Indigenous communities, this dynamic feels all too familiar. They've seen resource rushes before, and they know how these stories typically end, with their lands disrupted, their communities divided, and most of the economic benefits flowing elsewhere. The difference this time is that Indigenous rights are better protected legally, and communities are more organized and politically sophisticated than in previous generations. The environmental stakes are also significant. The Ring of Fire region is part of a vast peatland ecosystem that plays a crucial role in carbon storage and climate regulation. Large-scale mining development could have major environmental impacts that go far beyond the immediate extraction sites. Indigenous communities have traditionally been the stewards of these lands, and many are concerned about the long-term environmental stages of rapid development. What's particularly galling to Indigenous leaders is the narrative that they're somehow standing in the way of Canadian economic progress or national security. As they point out, they're not opposed to development per se. They're opposed to development that ignores their rights, excludes them from decision-making, and treats their territories as resources to be exploited rather than homelands to be respected. The path forward isn't necessarily blocked, but it requires a fundamentally different approach than the fast-track development model that politicians are currently promoting. Meaningful consultation, benefit-sharing agreements, Indigenous ownership stakes, and environmental protections could potentially create a framework that works for everyone. But that takes time, patience, and political will, commodities that seem to be in short supply as trade tensions intensify. Some Indigenous leaders have suggested that the current crisis could actually be an opportunity to reset the relationship between governments and First Nations. Instead of using external pressure as an excuse to override Indigenous rights, Canada could use this moment to demonstrate what true partnership looks like in resource development. The stakes couldn't be higher. The Ring of Fire represents one of the world's largest undeveloped critical mineral deposits, with the potential to supply global markets for decades, but it also represents a test of whether Canada can develop its resources in a way that respects Indigenous rights and environmental sustainability, or whether external economic pressure will override domestic legal obligations and moral commitments. As this story continues to unfold, one thing is clear. Indigenous communities aren't going to be steamrolled by trade war rhetoric or political promises of fast-track development. They've been here before, they know their rights, and they're prepared to fight for them. Whether Canada's political leaders are prepared to listen and work in true partnership remains to be seen. The Ring of Fire controversy is ultimately about more than just mining permits or trade wars. It's about what kind of country Canada wants to be. Will it be one that respects Indigenous rights even when it's economically inconvenient? Or will external pressure be enough to make Canada abandon its legal obligations and moral commitments? The Indigenous communities of Northern Ontario are making sure that question doesn't get answered without their voices being heard.